candle gutters in a rented room just off Aldersgate Street. And a voice, not famous, not recorded, belonging to a man whose name history did not think to keep, is reading aloud from Martin Luther. It is Wednesday evening, the 24th of May, 1738, in London, and the hour is closing in on 9 o'clock. A small society has gathered here, as it gathers most evenings, plain people, tradesmen and their wives, meeting to sing a hymn or two, to pray, to hear something read that might feed a hungry soul through another ordinary week. Tonight the reading is Luther's preface to his commentary on the Epistle to the Romans. Among the dozen or so listeners sits a 34-year-old Church of England priest, a fellow of Lincoln College, Oxford, a former missionary to Georgia, a man who has fasted and prayed and visited prisons and rowed against every current of his own age toward holiness with more discipline than almost anyone alive. His name is John Wesley, and in a few minutes his heart is going to catch fire. He did not want to be in that room. He says so himself, plainly, without embarrassment, in the journal he kept. He went, in his own words, very unwillingly. If you have read the journal as many times as I have, and by now the pages of mine have given up trying to hold together, you already know this scene by heart, the way you know the sound of your own front door. But if this is your first time meeting Mr. Wesley, let me walk you into the room properly, because everything else in his long life, all 87 years of it, bends toward this 1/4 of an hour the way a compass needle bends toward the north. The man reads on. He comes to the place in Luther's preface where the German reformer describes the change God works in the heart through faith in Christ. Not an idea about God, not a resolution to try harder, but a living confidence that Christ has done for the sinner what the sinner could never do for himself. And there, about 9:15, something happens to John Wesley that no theology lecture at Oxford, and no rule of the Holy Club, and no missionary voyage across the Atlantic had ever managed to produce. Let him tell it. These are his own words, written that same night, and I would not trade a syllable of them for anything more polished. I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone, for salvation. And an assurance was given me that he had taken away my sins, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. Read that again slowly. Not I understood a doctrine, not I resolved to be better. I felt my heart strangely warmed. Something happened to him, happened in the passive voice, as a gift received rather than an achievement earned. And in that warmth he found himself trusting, really trusting, not partly leaning and partly still gripping the rail himself, but trusting Christ alone. And with that trust came something he had sought for years without ever quite laying hold of it, an assurance, personal and unshakable, that his sins, his, specifically by name, not sins in the abstract, were forgiven. This room, this reading, this 9:15, is what the whole Methodist family has come to call Aldersgate. We say the word the way other families say a wedding date or a birth. It needs no further explanation among us, and yet it deserves, always, to be told again in full, because a story this important should never harden into shorthand. So let us slow down and ask what led him into that room on a night he did not want to go, and what it meant that once inside it, he could not leave the same man who entered. The day itself had already been strange, if you look closely at it, as though Providence were tuning an instrument before the concert. That morning Mr. Wesley had gone to St. Paul's Cathedral, and the anthem sung that day was drawn from the Psalms. Out of the deep have I called unto thee, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. A man crying from the depths for God to hear him, and by evening, unwillingly, reluctantly, almost as if dragged rather than drawn, he found himself in a small room where God did exactly that. I do not think Mr. Wesley himself missed the shape of that day once he looked back on it. Providence rarely announces itself with fanfare. More often it hums quietly under events until, looking back, you can finally hear the tune. Now here is something I want you to notice carefully, because it is easy to misunderstand Aldersgate and turn it into a story it was never meant to be. This was not a wicked man becoming a good one. This was not a scoundrel turning respectable. By May of 1738, John Wesley was already, by any ordinary measure, one of the most disciplined, self-denying, devoutly serious clergymen in England. He had grown up in the rectory at Epworth under his mother Susanna's relentless, loving formation, a household of order, catechism, and daily prayer that shaped him before he could walk properly on his own. As a boy, he had been pulled living from the flames of that burning rectory in 1709, and for the rest of his life he called himself a brand plucked from the burning, a man who understood his very existence as borrowed time, owed back to God. At Oxford he had helped found and lead the Holy Club, a small band of students, so methodical in their devotions, fixed hours of prayer, regular fasting, prison visitation, careful examination of conscience, that other students mocked them with the very name that would come, in time, to describe a worldwide movement, Methodists. He had been ordained a priest of the Church of England. He had sailed to the new colony of Georgia as a missionary, eager to preach the primitive gospel to English settlers and native peoples alike. None of it had worked the way he hoped. The Georgia mission had ended in personal disappointment and public humiliation, and he had sailed home in 1738 a discouraged man, uncertain of his own standing before God despite years of relentless effort to earn it. On the voyage out to America, in fact, his ship had been caught in a terrifying Atlantic storm, the kind that snapped a mainsail and left English passengers screaming in panic, while a group of Moravian settlers on board sang hymns through the whole ordeal, calm as if the sea itself answered to their master, Mr. Wesley never forgot the sight of that calm. He asked one of the Moravians afterward whether he had not been afraid, and the German simply answered that he was not, because he was not afraid to die. Wesley, priest though he was, missionary though he was, knew in that moment that whatever those Moravians possessed, he did not yet have it himself. That question followed him home across the ocean. In London he sought out the Moravians again, and in particular a young Moravian minister named Peter Böhler, freshly arrived from Germany and barely into his 20s, who nonetheless became, providentially, one of the most important teachers Mr. Wesley ever had. Böhler pressed him, gently but relentlessly, on the difference between the faith of a servant and the faith of a son, between believing certain things about God and actually resting one's whole confidence in Christ for salvation, moment by moment, as a settled trust rather than an anxious striving. Mr. Wesley, characteristically honest with himself, even when the honesty was painful, protested that he did not have such faith, and that perhaps he ought to stop preaching it until he did. Böhler's answer has become one of the treasured lines of our whole tradition. Preach faith till you have it, he told him. And then, because you have it, you will preach it. It is advice any class leader worth the name still gives today to someone waiting for their heart to catch up with their obedience. And so through the early months of 1738 Mr. Wesley kept preaching a faith he did not yet fully possess, kept praying, kept meeting with the little society that gathered in Fetter Lane, kept searching Scripture with the same rigor he had always brought to it, because whatever else was uncertain in him, his commitment to searching the Word honestly, weighing it against the wisdom of the Fathers, testing it with reason, and watching for its fruit in experience never wavered. He was, even in his hungriest and most unsettled season, already practicing the pattern of careful, many-sided discernment that would mark his theology for the rest of his life. He simply had not yet felt, in his own heart, the thing he had spent years urging on others. Then, 3 days before Aldersgate, on the 21st of May, his own brother Charles, his closest companion since childhood, his partner in the Holy Club, already ill in bed at the time, experienced his own assurance of forgiveness, his own peace with God, and rose from that sickbed changed. Charles wrote a hymn to mark the occasion, the first of what would become thousands. John visited him that week and heard the whole account, and something in him must have ached with a longing he could not yet name. 3 days later, walking very unwillingly into a room on Aldersgate Street, he found what his brother had already found, what the Moravians on the storm-tossed ship had already found, what Susanna's long years of catechism and Oxford's long years of discipline had been preparing him, without his full knowledge, to receive. This is why the warmth mattered so much, and why it still matters to us today, 300 years on. It was not that Mr. Wesley had been irreligious before Aldersgate, quite the opposite. It was that he had been striving, for the whole of his adult life, to earn by discipline what can only be received by trust. He had climbed every ladder holiness could offer a man of his era: fasting, prayer, works of mercy, careful self-examination, missionary sacrifice. And at the top of all that climbing he had found, not peace, but exhaustion and doubt. What happened in that room was not the addition of one more rung to the ladder. It was the discovery that the ladder had never been the way up at all, that grace comes down, unearned, to meet the sinner exactly where striving leaves off. That grace, we would come to understand more fully as his life went on, had in fact been going before him the whole time, in every gift, every book, every storm, every failed voyage, drawing him toward this room and this reading and this quarter before 9, long before he ever felt the warmth of it arrive. He had not run to God. God, all along, had been running to him. Mr. Wesley did not walk out of that room a perfect man, and he never claimed to. He walked out an assured one, sure, for the first time in a settled and abiding way, that Christ's righteousness and not his own was the ground on which he stood. Everything that followed in his extraordinary life, the open fields where he would preach to tens of thousands who had never darkened a church door, the societies and classes and bands he built to hold new believers steady in love, the hymns his brother would write by the thousand, the doctrine of a heart made whole in love, that he would spend the rest of his days teaching and living and defending, all of it flows out from this one warmed and trusting heart in a rented room on Aldersgate Street. That is where we begin, you and I, because it is where the whole story turns. Everything before this evening was preparation, much of it hidden even from Wesley himself. Everything after it was consequence, worked out across 5 decades and 3 kingdoms and, eventually, an ocean. We will go back, in the chapters ahead, to Epworth and the fire and Susanna's nursery and the rigours of Oxford, to see how God was forming this brand plucked from the burning long before he knew the shape of his own rescue. And we will follow him forward from this room, into the fields and the societies and the long faithful evening of his life. But I wanted you to meet him here first, already changed, heart still warm, because this is the John Wesley the whole Methodist family has loved for 300 years, not a marble figure on a pedestal, but a man who walked unwillingly into a small room one Wednesday evening and came out trusting Christ alone. The fire started sometime after 11 on the night of Wednesday, the 9th of February, 1709, in the thatch above the rectory at Epworth. Nobody in the house smelled smoke until it was already running along the roofline like something alive, and by the time Samuel Wesley woke to the cry of fire from the nursery, the flames had eaten through to the sky. Picture the house as it was, a long, low rectory of timber and plaster, thatched in reed, standing at the edge of a market town in the flat fen country of Lincolnshire, 10 children asleep or half asleep inside it, and their father, a proud, stubborn, learned man, rector of Epworth for 20 years, and not always beloved for it, startled out of bed by smoke pouring under his door. Samuel Wesley had enemies in that parish. He had jailed debtors and been jailed himself for debt. He had preached hard sermons and made harder enemies. Some among his own flock, it was long believed, had set a torch to his roof before and might have done so again. Whatever lit that thatch, it burned fast, and it burned toward a house full of sleeping children. Samuel got his wife and most of the children out through doors and windows on the ground floor, counting heads as fathers do in terror, herding them into the yard in their nightclothes while the sky above the house went orange. Susanna, heavy with the family's 20th pregnancy, could not go out the way the others had gone. The stairs by then were choked with smoke and falling sparks, and she waded through flame at the last, her clothes singed, to reach the yard alive. It was a near thing for her. It was a nearer thing, in a few minutes more, for one small boy the counting had missed. John was 5 years old that winter. The nursery he slept in was upstairs, at the back of the house, and in the smoke and shouting and the scramble to get bodies outdoors, No one thought to go back up the stairs for him. He woke on his own, the room already thick and orange lit, and did what a 5-year-old does when the house is burning and no one has come. He went to the window. Below in the yard, someone looked up and saw a small white face pressed against the glass with the roof already catching fire above him. There was no ladder long enough to reach that height, and no time to fetch one if there had been. What there was a man. The record does not give us his name with certainty, only his courage, who set himself against the wall, and a second man who climbed onto his shoulders and reached up and got hold of the boy through the casement and pulled him out and down into the yard a bare minute or two before the roof gave way and came down in a roar of flame and collapsing timber onto the very room where he had been standing. Samuel Wesley, they tell us, fell to his knees in the yard the moment the child was set safely on the ground and counted, at last, all his children living. "Come, neighbors," he is remembered to have said, "let us kneel down, let us give thanks to God. He has given me all my 8 children. Let the house go, I am rich enough." The rectory burned to its foundations before morning. Every book in Samuel's study, every sermon he had labored over for 2 decades, the family's furniture, its plate, its small store of comforts, all of it went into the Lincolnshire night as ash. And in the yard, wrapped against the cold, stood a boy who by every reasonable account should not have been standing there at all. It was Susanna who named what had happened to her son, and she named it out of Scripture, because Scripture was the language in which this family thought about everything that mattered. In the 3rd chapter of Zechariah, the prophet sees Joshua the high priest standing filthy before the angel of the Lord, and the Lord rebukes the accuser and says of Joshua, "Is not this a brand plucked out of the fire?" Susanna took that image and laid it over her son like a mantle, and in the years afterward, whenever she prayed over him or spoke of him, she used to say she felt a special obligation to be more particularly careful of the soul of this child that God had so mercifully provided for, seeing that he had, in so remarkable a manner, been snatched from the fire. John never let go of it. Decades later, as an old man surrounded by the fruit of a lifetime's ministry, societies raised up across 2 kingdoms, thousands converted, a whole people gathered and disciplined and set to singing, he still had an engraving made of himself as a boy at that upstairs window, flames licking up around the frame, and beneath it he had printed, in his own chosen words, a brand plucked from the burning. It was not sentiment, it was theology, worn as a name. He believed, without any of the false modesty that sometimes passes for humility, that his life had been given back to him rather than merely lived by him, and that everything that came after, Oxford, Georgia, the fields at Bristol, the room on Aldersgate Street, was time that belonged, by right, to the fire. But the rescue at the window is only half the story of what Epworth made of him, and it may not even be the larger half. A boy pulled from a burning roof still has to be raised, still has to be shaped day by day into whatever he is going to become. And the raising of him was Susanna Wesley's work, undertaken with a rigor that would have exhausted a lesser woman, and did, in fact, very nearly exhaust her. Susanna bore 19 children in the course of her marriage. Only 10 of them lived past infancy, and burying 9 children, some of them within days of birth, one after a fire of a different and less merciful kind, did nothing to soften her convictions about how the ones who lived ought to be governed. She wrote out, years later, at John's own request, a long letter describing the method by which she had raised her family, and it remains one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of Christian child-rearing, because it is not sentimental in the smallest degree. It is a rule of life applied to nurseries. The children of that house were put on a schedule from the cradle. Susanna believed that an infant could be taught, by patient and unbroken repetition, to sleep through the night and take its food at fixed hours rather than on demand, and she managed it with every one of them. As soon as a child could sit upright at a table, it was taught to eat quietly and to ask for nothing between meals. As soon as it could speak, it was taught to ask for what it wanted softly, never by crying, because this was Susanna's own phrase, and John copied it out faithfully in his own later writings on Christian education. When a child is corrected, it must be conquered, and this will be no hard matter to do. if it be not grown headstrong by too much indulgence. She held that the will of a small child, left unchecked, hardens into the will of a grown sinner, and that the whole work of Christian nurture was to break that self-will early, gently if possible but thoroughly in any case, so that reason and religion might govern the soul instead of appetite. It is a hard doctrine to modern ears. It did not feel hard to the children who received it as simple, unquestioned order, the water they swam in. Each child, boy or girl, was taught the alphabet in a single day. Susanna insisted on this, and insisted it could be done, and by every account it generally was, and then set at once to reading, beginning always, with the first chapter of Genesis, so that the very first sentences a Wesley child learned to sound out were, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." No child was set any other lesson until reading was mastered, because Susanna held that a soul which could not read the scripture for itself was a soul left at the mercy of whatever it was told, and she did not intend any child of hers to be at anyone's mercy in that way, least of all in matters of the soul. School itself ran 6 hours a day, with a strict order of subjects, and infractions of the household rules were noted and answered for. But so too was obedience noted and rewarded, and a child who confessed a fault honestly was never punished for the fault twice over, once for the deed and once for the lie that might have covered it. Susanna thought a great deal about the shape of consequences, about what taught a child truth and what merely taught a child fear, and she held those two things to be very different lessons indeed. And once each week, without fail, Susanna took each child alone, one evening for this one, another evening for that, and talked with him or her privately about the state of the soul. John's evening was Thursday. We do not have transcripts of what passed between them in those hours, but we know enough of the woman and enough of the man that emerged to guess at their shape, searching questions about sin and grace, about the meaning of a verse read that week, about whether the child's private conduct matched the child's public profession. It was, in miniature, the very practice John would build an entire revival upon 30 years later. Small groups, searching questions, believers giving account of their souls to one another in the fear and love of God. He did not invent the class meeting out of nothing in a room in Bristol. He had sat in one, alone with his mother, on Thursday evenings in Epworth, before he had any Greek, any Oxford friendships, any thought of Georgia or fields or the open air. When Samuel was away from home, and he was away often, called to London for long stretches on the business of convocation, Susanna did not let the household's spiritual life lapse in his absence. She gathered the family and whatever neighbors cared to come, on Sunday evenings in the kitchen of the rectory, and read a sermon aloud, and prayed with them, and before long so many of the parish were crowding into that kitchen that the numbers rivaled her husband's own Sunday congregation. A curate serving in Samuel's absence wrote to complain of it. Susanna wrote back to her husband, when he in turn questioned the propriety of a woman holding what amounted to public religious meetings, with an answer of such calm, scriptural, immovable confidence, that Samuel let the matter drop and the kitchen services continued. She was not a woman easily talked out of what she believed God required of her, and John was watching, all the while, how that kind of conviction looked when it was worn by someone he loved and trusted absolutely. It is worth pausing on the plainness of it. There is no vision in this part of the story, no voice from heaven, no fire falling twice. There is a woman with a schedule and a Bible and a settled theology of grace, working that theology patiently into 10 living children over the whole span of her adult life. One meal, one Thursday evening, one conquered tantrum at a time. But it was in that plain and disciplined nursery, quite as much as in the flaming window at Epworth, that the man who would give the world Methodism first took his shape. The rescue told him he had been kept alive for a purpose. The nursery told him what a disciplined life devoted to that purpose might actually look like, hour by hour, rule by rule, soul by examined soul. He carried both all his life, and he never separated them, not even at the end. When he was an old man, preaching still, riding still, rising still at 4 in the morning, out of a habit ingrained in him, before he had any doctrine of his own to explain it, he would sometimes tell the story of the fire to a congregation, and let them draw whatever lesson they liked from a 5-year-old boy pulled from a falling roof. But he knew, better than any of his hearers could, that the miracle at the window and the method in the kitchen were a single mercy worked by a single God upon a single boy who would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of both. Christ Church, Oxford, in the autumn of 1725. In a small set of rooms overlooking Tom Quad, a young man of 22 sits with a borrowed book open on his knee. He has come to Oxford 5 years before as a cheerful, quick-witted, rather ordinary undergraduate, fond of company, no stranger to cards and idle talk. A young gentleman making his way pleasantly enough through the life of the college. But something in the pages before him will not let him rest. The book is William Law's A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life, and its argument falls on him like a hammer, that there is no such thing as a halfway Christian, no safe middle ground between the world and the wholehearted love of God. Wesley will later say of that season of reading, Law joined to Jeremy Taylor's Holy Living and Holy Dying, and to Thomas à Kempis's Imitation of Christ, which he had already begun to absorb, that it convinced him utterly of one thing: to give God some of his heart was to give God nothing at all. Either the whole life belonged to God, intention and appetite and hour and shilling alike, or none of it did. That conviction did not arrive as warmth. It arrived as a summons to labor, and the young man who received it was exactly the sort of man who would answer a summons to labor with everything he had. This is the Wesley of the Oxford years, not yet the field preacher, not yet the man whose heart would be strangely warmed in a room on Aldersgate Street, but a serious, disciplined, almost fierce young scholar, convinced that if holiness was the goal, then holiness must be reached the way any other goal was reached, by method, by rule, by the relentless application of a well-ordered will. It is one of the most instructive chapters in the whole of his story, precisely because it shows us a soul doing everything right and still, in the deepest sense, not yet free. He had come up to Christ Church in 1720 on the strength of a Charterhouse education and a family reputation for cleverness, and he had made himself at home there in the ordinary way of clever young men, reading widely, arguing happily, enjoying his friends, not despising a pleasant evening. Susanna's letters from Epworth followed him, as they always would follow her children wherever they scattered, full of counsel and correction, and, increasingly in these years, of serious theological conversation. Mother and son debated free will, the extent of grace, the claims of Scripture against the claims of custom, and in these exchanges we can already see the ground being prepared for convictions that would flower fully only after Aldersgate. Susanna's steady insistence, against the hard predestinarian teaching of the day, that God's grace reaches out to every soul and leaves no one without the capacity to respond. It was her theology, argued patiently in letter after letter, that gave her son the seedbed for what the Methodist people would one day call prevenient grace, the conviction that God moves first, toward all, before any of us moves toward him. John did not yet have the words for it, but he was being formed in it, at his mother's writing desk, long before he needed it. Ordination came in September of 1725, when the Bishop of Oxford laid hands on him as deacon. It was in one sense an unremarkable step for a clergyman's son, the natural next rung for a young man of his background and education. But Wesley did not take it lightly. He examined himself with a rigor that alarmed even Susanna, questioning his motives, his fitness, his sincerity, weighing whether he sought the office for God's glory or his own comfort. This habit of ruthless self-examination, turning the same unsparing eye on his own soul that he turned on a difficult Greek text, would mark every year that followed. He kept diaries, he drew up resolutions, he examined his use of time hour by hour, and where he found himself wanting, he did not excuse it, he simply resolved again to do better. The following March brought an honor that changed his standing at the university for good: election as a Fellow of Lincoln College. It was no small thing. Fellowships were limited, competitive, and jealously guarded, and a Fellow of Lincoln enjoyed rooms of his own, a stipend, a voice in college affairs, and the kind of quiet prestige that opened doors for the rest of a scholarly life. His father, Samuel, old and often beleaguered by debt and difficult parishioners at Epworth, wrote to say he was overjoyed, and more than that, he told his son plainly that whatever else came of it, Lincoln would give him independence, a footing of his own in the world. For Susanna's brilliant, restless second surviving son, it was the confirmation of everything the family had hoped for him. He was ordained priest in 1728, and by every outward measure of the Church of England in that century, John Wesley's future was set, a comfortable, respected, entirely conventional career as a college don and country clergyman, teaching logic to undergraduates, taking pupils, perhaps one day a country living of his own. He left Oxford for a time after his fellowship was secured, going out to Epworth and the neighbouring parish of Root to assist his aging father, who badly needed the help. It was hard, unglamorous parish work, visiting the sick, burying the dead, preaching to indifferent congregations in a poor Lincolnshire living, doing the unremarkable daily labour of a country curate. He did it faithfully for the better part of 2 years. But Lincoln College wanted its fellow back for tutorial duties, and in November of 1729 he returned to Oxford to find that in his absence something had already begun without him. His younger brother Charles, still an undergraduate at Christ Church, had gathered a handful of serious-minded students who met together for mutual encouragement in study and devotion. Young men troubled, as John himself had been troubled, by the gap between the university's spiritual mediocrity and the New Testament's plain demands. It was a small, tentative thing when John found it, a few friends reading the Greek Testament together, praying together, trying in a rather uncertain way to hold each other to some standard higher than the common run of college life. John Wesley was not, by nature, a man who could look at a small, tentative thing and leave it small and tentative. He was the eldest among them, a fellow of the university with standing and authority the undergraduates did not have, and he possessed, as he would possess all his life, an organizing genius that could not rest until scattered good intentions had been gathered into a rule. Within weeks, the loose fellowship of friends had become something else, a society with a method, and what a method it was. The little band, never more than 25 or 30 at its height, usually far fewer, rose at 4 in the morning for private prayer. They set aside fixed hours through the day for the study of Scripture in the original languages, for self-examination, for intercession. They fasted, following the ancient practice of the early church, on Wednesdays and Fridays, until 3 in the afternoon. They took the Lord's Supper as often as the college chapels would allow it, weekly, sometimes more, at a time when most of their fellow students and even many senior clergy thought monthly communion excessive. They kept diaries in which they recorded not only their outward actions, but the state of their souls hour by hour, grading themselves against resolutions written down in advance, refusing to let a single evening pass without an honest reckoning of how the day had been spent and whether it had been spent for God. They did not confine their discipline to the chapel and the study. Oxford in the 1720s had its full share of the poor, the imprisoned, and the forgotten, and the little society made a point of seeking them out. They visited the debtors and felons crowded into the castle prison and the wretched cells of the Bucado, bringing them what comfort and instruction they could, and in time raised money among themselves and their friends to relieve the prisoners' worst wants, food, clothing, the fees that kept a man locked up even after his debt was paid. They visited the poor in the town's workhouses. They gathered destitute children and taught them to read. They gave away, deliberately and as a matter of principle, whatever money they did not need for bare subsistence, refusing to let comfort creep in under the name of necessity. It was, by any honest measure, an extraordinary display of practical charity from a handful of Oxford students, and it was also, in its way, entirely typical of how John Wesley would spend the rest of his life, turning private conviction immediately into organized public action, unable to let a conviction remain merely felt when it might instead be lived out on a schedule. Oxford noticed, and Oxford was not kind. The university had its share of wits who found the little group's earnestness an easy target, and the nicknames came thick and fast: the Bible moths for their relentless study of Scripture, the sacramentarians for their frequency at the altar rail, the enthusiasts, a word that in the 18th century was no compliment at all, but a serious charge of religious excess bordering on delusion. The name that stuck, coined by a mocking student who thought he was landing an insult, was Methodists, a jab at their fussy, regimented, almost medical precision about the soul's health, as though they were physicians following a method of treatment rather than men simply trying to love God. It was meant to wound. The Wesleys and their friends, characteristically, took it as a badge instead. There was something exactly right about the label, even in its mockery, because method was precisely what they believed in, not as an end in itself, but as the necessary scaffolding for a holiness they were certain could be built, plank by plank, through disciplined and relentless effort. And this is the heart of what these Oxford years show us, if we have the eyes to see it rightly. The young John Wesley of the Holy Club was not a lukewarm man playing at religion. He was in deadly earnest, more earnest than almost any young clergyman of his generation, willing to rise before dawn and fast until his head ached, and walk the fetid corridors of the castle prison, because he believed, truly, with his whole intellect and will, that this was what love of God required. He denied himself sleep, food, comfort, reputation, the easy company of his college, all for the sake of a holiness he was chasing with everything in him. There is something in this that every serious Christian recognizes and, if honest, half admires: the sheer refusal to settle for less than the whole of the Gospel's demand. But there is something else in it too, something the mature Wesley, the Wesley who would one day stand in a room on Aldersgate Street and feel his heart strangely warmed, would look back on with a kind of tender sorrow, for all his fasting, for all his rising at 4, for all his hours of self-examination and his diaries thick with resolutions kept and broken and renewed. The young fellow of Lincoln College did not yet possess the one thing his own method could never manufacture, the settled assurance that he was, in fact, beloved and accepted by God, not on the strength of his discipline, but as a free gift of grace. He was climbing. He believed, with every fiber of his considerable will, that holiness lay at the top of a ladder, and that the ladder could be scaled if only a man climbed hard enough, rose early enough, denied himself thoroughly enough. He had not yet learned, could not yet have learned, for it is not a lesson the will can teach itself, that the ladder does not reach, that no measure of fasting closes the distance between a sinner and a holy God, and that the very grace which had already been quietly at work in him since his mother's knee and his father's burning rectory was not waiting at the top of the ladder to reward his ascent, but standing at the bottom all along, ready to lift him up as a gift he could never have earned. That lesson lay a full decade ahead of him still, and further trials, a mission across the ocean to a raw new colony called Georgia, a painful and public failure of the heart, a long homeward voyage in a storm that terrified him, while it left a shipload of German strangers singing hymns in perfect peace, would have to do their slow work first. But we should not for one moment think these Oxford years were wasted, or that the disciplined young deacon poring over a Kempis by candlelight was simply a mistaken man to be corrected later and forgotten. Everything that Methodism would become, its insistence on holy living, its refusal to separate personal piety from active mercy to the poor and imprisoned, its instinct for method and structure in the service of grace, its confidence that a serious soul could and should organize its whole life around the pursuit of God, every bit of that was forged here, in these Oxford rooms and Oxford prisons, under Charles's founding impulse and John's relentless hand. The Holy Club was not a detour on the way to Aldersgate. It was the workshop where the tools of the coming revival were being shaped, long before the man who would wield them knew what they were for. He left Oxford in the autumn of 1735, still uncertain, still striving, still, by his own later testimony, a stranger to the peace he was so desperately laboring to earn. Ahead of him lay the ocean, and Georgia, and a failure that would strip away nearly every prop his method had built. It was a mercy, though he could not have known it then, that the ladder was about to be taken away from him entirely, so that grace alone might set him on his feet. The mast groaned before it split. That was the sound Mr. Wesley remembered afterward. Not the wind, not even the water pouring green over the deck, but the crack of good English timber giving way somewhere above him in the dark, and the certainty that followed it. I am going to die in this ocean, and I am afraid. It was January of 1736, somewhere in mid-Atlantic aboard the ship Simmons, bound for the new colony of Georgia. General James Oglethorpe had invited John and his brother Charles along on his second voyage to the settlement he had founded 3 years before. Charles to serve as his secretary for Indian affairs, John to be the colony's parish priest, and, if God gave opening, a missionary to the Creek and Chickasaw nations beyond it. It was the kind of assignment the Oxford Methodist in him had waited for his whole adult life. Here at last was primitive Christianity, with nowhere to hide from it, no comfortable college rooms, no familiar Epworth pulpit, only an ocean, a raw colony, and souls who had never heard the gospel preached at all. He had boarded that ship in October, certain that God was sending him to convert a wilderness. The storm did not care about his certainty. Twice on the crossing gales struck with a violence that reduced the English passengers to screaming, weeping heaps on the deck, Mr. Wesley among them, gripping whatever timber would hold still. He had spent a decade disciplining his hours, his appetites, his very thoughts. None of it had prepared him for the plain animal fear of drowning. He wrote afterward, with the brutal honesty that never once left his pen even when the truth cut against him, that he had been unwilling to die. And a few yards away, through the worst of it, a company of German Moravian emigrants, 26 of them, traveling under their Bishop David Nitschmann to found a settlement of their own in Georgia, sang. They did not sing bravely, the way a man sings to keep his courage up. They sang the way a man sings who has already settled the question the storm was asking. Mr. Wesley went to one of them afterward, in the lull, and asked whether he had not been afraid. "I thank God, no," the Moravian answered. Mr. Wesley pressed him, but were not his women and children afraid? "No," came the reply. "Our women and children are not afraid to die." He recorded the exchange in his journal that night, and if you read it closely you can feel him turning the words over and over, unable to set them down. He had crossed an ocean to bring these people the gospel. He had just watched them ride out a storm that had broken him, singing a hymn he half suspected he did not yet know the meaning of himself. It was not the last time the Moravians would undo him. Within days of stepping onto Georgia soil in February, the colony's third year, the town of Savannah still raw cut out of pine forest, its streets more surveyor's lines than roads, Mr. Wesley sought out a Moravian pastor already settled there, a gentle and searching man named August Gottlieb Spangenberg. He went hoping for counsel on how to conduct himself among strangers in a new land. What he got was an examination he had not expected and could not pass. Spangenberg did not ask him about his rule of life, his fasting, his rising hour, all the disciplines Mr. Wesley could have recited without pausing for breath. He asked something else. Did Mr. Wesley have the witness in himself? Did the Spirit of God bear witness with his spirit that he was a child of God? Mr. Wesley, by his own account, did not know what to say. Spangenberg tried again, more simply. Did he know Jesus Christ? "I know he is the Savior of the world, Mr. Wesley answered, a true sentence, a catechism sentence, the kind of thing any Oxford don could produce on demand. Spangenberg was not satisfied. "True," he said, "but do you know he has saved you?" And Mr. Wesley, the most disciplined young priest in the Church of England, a man who had spent 10 years methodically pursuing holiness with a rigor that had earned him mockery at the university, could only answer, "I hope he has died to save me." He wrote later, with the same unsparing candor, that he feared they were vain words. Hold that scene a moment, because it is the hinge of this whole chapter, perhaps of this whole book. Everything Mr. Wesley would attempt in Georgia, every rule he enforced, every soul he tried to save, every heart he broke, including in the end his own, grew out of a young priest trying desperately to give away a certainty he did not privately possess. He knew the doctrine of salvation better than almost any man in America. He did not yet know, in Spangenberg's sense of know, that it was his. He set about his parish work with tremendous energy and very little mercy, least of all toward himself. He rose at 4 each morning and expected his congregation to keep something like the same hours. He fasted on the primitive church's schedule and urged others to do the same. He insisted that baptism, to be valid, be performed by immersion wherever the child's health allowed it, and he refused, on strict grounds of church order, to bury the dead or admit to communion those who had not been properly confirmed by episcopal hands. Some of this was simply the fruit of Oxford transplanted wholesale into a raw colonial parish that had never asked for quite so much rigor. Savannah was a settlement of debtors, adventurers and refugees, trying to grow indigo and keep their families alive. It was not a monastery, and it did not want one. Mr. Wesley, for all his learning and all his genuine love of souls, could not yet see the difference between the holiness God was offering these people and the holiness he was, in effect, imposing on them. And then there was Sophia Hopke. She was the niece of Thomas Corston, the colony's chief magistrate, a young woman of grace and intelligence who began attending Mr. Wesley for instruction in French and in Scripture, and whose company he came, quite simply, to love. He does not disguise this in his journal, and neither should we. It does him no dishonor. He was a young man, unmarried, far from home, and Sophia Hopke was kind to him in a colony that was often anything but. For months he circled the question of marrying her, the way he circled every serious decision of his life, praying over it, consulting Scripture, and finally, in the Moravian manner he so admired, submitting the matter to the casting of lots, a practice by which the brethren sought God's direct will in doubtful matters. The lot came back against the marriage. Mr. Wesley, ever obedient to whatever authority he had submitted himself to, drew back. Sophia Hopke, understandably, did not wait forever on a man who could not bring himself to speak plainly. In March of 1737 she married another settler, William Williamson. Here the story turns from heartbreak into scandal, and there is no way to tell it, or reason to try to tell it, without some plain sorrow for everyone involved. Mr. Wesley, still her spiritual director, grew convinced in the months that followed that Mrs. Williamson had fallen into behavior unbecoming a communicant, precisely what, he never stated publicly, and the record is genuinely thin on the point, so we should not pretend to know more than the sources allow. What is certain is that in August of 1737 he repelled her from Holy Communion, publicly, before the congregation of Savannah. Her uncle, the magistrate, did not receive this as an act of pastoral discipline. He received it as the act of a jilted suitor abusing his office to wound a woman who had refused him, and he had Mr. Wesley indicted before a grand jury on a startling list of charges, not only the communion refusal, but disputes over parish practice, stretching back months, some substantial, some almost absurd. The grand jury itself was divided. A number of its members refused to find a true bill on most of the counts. But the colony had turned against its priest, and Mr. Wesley, seeing no path to a fair hearing and no further use for himself in Savannah, made the only decision left to him. On the 2nd of December, 1737, he posted a notice of his intention to return to England, and slipped out of Savannah that same evening on foot, walking overland through pine woods and swamp toward Charleston with 3 companions, evading, by his own account, officers sent to stop him from leaving before the charges were resolved. It was not a triumphant exit. He had come to Georgia not yet 2 years before to convert a wilderness, certain of his calling if uncertain, deep down, of his own heart. He left it a fugitive from a grand jury, his ministry in ruins, the woman he had failed to marry now married to another man and estranged from him besides, and not one soul among the Creek or Chickasaw ever having heard him preach at all. He sailed from Charleston on the 22nd of December and spent the long weeks of the Atlantic crossing doing what he always did in every season of his life, storm or calm, triumph or wreckage. He kept his journal, and he searched his own soul without mercy or flattery. And there, somewhere on that homeward voyage, cold and defeated, and further from the confident young priest who had boarded the Simmons 2 years before than he had ever been from anything, he set down one of the most startling sentences a man of his training and reputation ever wrote about himself. "I went to America to convert the Indians, but oh, who shall convert me?" Sit with that sentence. It is not despair, not exactly, though it comes close enough to touch despair's hand. It is something rarer and, in the end, something far more hopeful. It is a learned, disciplined, devout Church of England priest, admitting, in his own words, in his own private record, that all his rules had not yet made him what Spangenberg's simple question had asked him to be. He had catechisms enough for a diocese. He had fasted more than most monks. He had crossed an ocean and risked his life for people who did not want what he was offering, in the form he insisted on offering it. And still, when a Moravian asked him plainly whether he knew that Christ had saved him, the honest answer had been no. We ought not to read the Georgia mission, as some have been tempted to, as a wasted 2 years, a detour, an embarrassment best skipped past on the way to the story's real beginning. It was nothing of the kind. It was the furnace God used to burn away the last of Mr. Wesley's confidence in his own religion, so that when the true fire came he would have nothing left to trust but grace itself. Every rule he had enforced in Savannah had been sincere. That is what makes the failure instructive rather than merely sad. A man can be utterly sincere and utterly right about doctrine, and still be trying, with everything in him, to manufacture by discipline what can only ever be received as gift. Georgia did not teach Mr. Wesley that holiness did not matter. It taught him that he could not produce it in himself by trying harder, and that no colony of strangers, however patiently instructed, could give him what he had never yet received. He landed at Deal on the 1st of February, 1738, a failed missionary of 34, his reputation shaken, his private journal full of a self-examination sharper than any bishop's censure could have been. He did not yet know, how could he, that within 4 months a different Moravian, a young man named Peter Burler, would sit across from him in London and press the very same question Spangenberg had asked in Savannah, and press it until Mr. Wesley had nowhere left to hide from it. He did not know that a small society meeting in Aldersgate Street was only weeks away, or that his heart, so long strangled by its own discipline, was about to be set free by something discipline could never have produced. What he knew, stepping off that gangplank onto English soil with the Georgia disaster behind him, was only this, that he had gone out to convert others and had come home unconverted himself, by his own reckoning, and that the religion he had practiced with such ferocious care for a decade had not yet given him what a boatload of singing Germans in an Atlantic gale had possessed without visible effort at all. It was the bleakest homecoming of his life. It was also, though he could not have named it yet, the last mile of the long road to Aldersgate, the emptying out that had to happen before the strange warmth could ever come and fill it. Bristol did not smell like Oxford. It smelled of coal smoke and wet wool and the River Avon at low tide. And when Mr. Wesley rode into the city at the end of March in 1739, he came as a man doing a friend an uncomfortable favor, not as a man who knew he was about to be remade a second time. The friend was George Whitefield, 24 years old, already the most electrifying preacher in England, and already in trouble with the bishops for it. Whitefield had spent the winter doing something no Church of England clergyman was supposed to do. He had walked out past the edge of Bristol to a mining settlement called Kingswood, and preached in the open fields to the colliers who lived there, men, women and children who dug coal from dawn to dark, and who had, in living memory, never once heard a sermon. Kingswood had no parish church to speak of, and no minister who wanted one. The colliers were considered by respectable Bristol to be scarcely Christian and scarcely civilized, a rough, forgotten population living on the edge of a prosperous city that preferred not to look at them too closely. Whitefield looked at them. He climbed a rise of ground called Hannam Mount and preached to 200 people the first time, then 1,000, then many thousands, and now he was leaving for America, and he wanted Mr. Wesley to take up the work he had begun. It should be said plainly what Whitefield was asking, because to Mr. Wesley's mind it was not a small thing. He was asking a man who had spent his whole life inside the structure of Anglican order, the parish, the pulpit, the liturgy read from the prescribed book, the discipline he had built his entire soul around at Oxford, to go and stand in a field with no pulpit, no walls, no bishop's license, and preach to whoever happened to be standing there. Mr. Wesley wrote of the invitation with an honesty that has comforted every reluctant Methodist who has come after him. "I could scarce reconcile myself at first," he confessed in his journal, "to this strange way of preaching in the fields, having been all my life till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order, that I should have thought the saving of souls almost a sin if it had not been done in a church. Read that sentence again, friends, because it is one of the most important sentences in the whole story. This is not a man born loose and easy, thrilled by novelty, itching to break rules. This is a man for whom decency and order were nearly sacred in themselves. The same man who had counted his hours at Oxford, examined his conscience by the clock, and organized his whole religious life around method. And that man is telling us, in his own hand, that he very nearly refused the field because it offended his sense of what was proper. Aldersgate had warmed his heart 11 months earlier. It had not yet, by his own admission, entirely loosened his grip on the shape he thought grace was supposed to take. But something in him had already begun to give way, and we should notice what it was. It was not an argument. Whitefield did not out-debate him. It was the sight when Mr. Wesley finally rode out to Kingswood himself and stood at the edge of one of Whitefield's gatherings, of several thousand colliers listening to the gospel, with their faces turned up and the tears running down through the coal dust on their cheeks. Mr. Wesley wrote of it afterward in a description that Methodists have never forgotten and never should. The tears, he said, made white gutters down their black faces. Picture that image and let it do its work on you. These were men who spent their days in darkness underground, men respectable Bristol crossed the street to avoid, men no minister had thought worth the ride out from the city. And here they stood in the weather, weeping at the news that God so loved the world. Mr. Wesley had spent a lifetime cultivating holiness through careful method. He now stood watching holiness break out, unbidden, among people who had no method at all, only hunger. He could not unsee it. On Saturday, the last day of March, he still hesitated. He prayed over it, turned it over with his friends, and by his own account decided the matter by lot, opening the scriptures at random for guidance, in the old Moravian and Wesleyan habit of seeking a providential word, and finding their instruction that steadied him toward yes. The following day, Sunday, he watched Whitefield preach once more, and felt the last of his resistance give way. And on Monday, the 2nd of April, 1739, John Wesley, Fellow of Lincoln College, ordained priest of the Church of England, a man who had once thought it nearly sinful to save a soul outside a church building, climbed a small rise of ground near Bristol and preached in the open air for the first time in his life. He chose his text with care because Mr. Wesley never did anything, even a thing he trembled at, without care. He preached from the 4th chapter of Luke, the passage where our Lord stands in the synagogue at Nazareth and reads from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor." There could not have been a text more exactly suited to the moment, and I do not think it was an accident that he chose it. Whatever fear he carried up that rise with him, he was answering it with scripture rather than argument, letting the word itself justify what decency alone would not. Some 3,000 people stood before him in the open field. There was no pulpit. There was no roof between him and the sky. And he preached. He wrote of the day with the same startled honesty he had brought to the whole decision. He described himself as having submitted to be more vile, borrowing the phrase, and Methodist readers will catch the echo, from King David dancing half-naked before the Ark of the Covenant in 2 Samuel, declaring that he would be yet more vile than this, and base in his own sight, if it meant honoring the Lord before the people. It is a remarkable thing for a fellow of Lincoln College to reach for that verse to describe preaching outdoors, and it tells you exactly how large the barrier felt to him, and exactly what crossing it cost his pride. He did not experience it as liberation, not at first. He experienced it as humiliation gladly accepted, because the alternative, silence, propriety, a gospel too carefully guarded to reach the people who needed it most, had become to him the greater sin. What happened next, over the following weeks, is the part of the story every Methodist ought to know by heart, because it is the moment the movement found its true shape. Mr. Wesley did not preach once at Kingswood and retreat back to safer ground. He went again and again. He preached at Hannam Mount and at Rose Green and in the brickyards and bowling greens of Bristol itself, wherever a crowd would gather and a patch of open ground would hold them. He preached at 5 in the morning before the colliers went down into the pits, because 5 in the morning was the only hour they had free, and he was willing to keep whatever hours the poor kept, rather than the hours convenient to a gentleman. The numbers only grew. Within weeks he was preaching to crowds that no church in England, however grand, could have seated under its own roof, 10,000 at a time, by his own careful counting, standing in the wind and the weather to hear a message that had once been confined behind a locked church door on a Sunday morning for whoever happened to hold the right pew. And here is the theology inside the scene, because with Mr. Wesley the theology is never far from the ground he is standing on. Every soul in that field at Kingswood, every collier, every wife, every barefoot child was there, in Wesley's understanding, because grace had already gone before them and made them ready to hear, whether they knew it or not. This is prevenient grace, lived out in the open air, rather than merely explained in a treatise. The conviction, planted in him at his mother's knee at Epworth, and confirmed 100 times over at Oxford, that God does not wait for a soul to earn its way toward hearing the gospel. God moves first. God stirs first. The Kingswood colliers had received no catechism, no confirmation, no gentle nurture in a well-run parish, and yet the Spirit had been working in them long before Mr. Wesley ever rode out to find them, preparing soil that no one else had thought to sow. Field preaching did not create their readiness. It answered a readiness prevenient grace had already put there, waiting for someone willing to come and see it. It is worth pausing on why no one else had come. Kingswood lay only a few miles from a city full of churches, full of clergy, full of professing Christians who would have called themselves earnest in their faith. And yet for generations the colliers had been left effectively unshepherded, considered too rough, too poor, too far beneath consideration to be worth the ride. Mr. Wesley's entire life's method, the discipline, the self-examination, the careful hours, had been forged in the most privileged corridors of English religious life. A rectory, a university, a Georgia mission funded by a trust with the king's ear. Kingswood was the first time that whole apparatus of learning and holiness was placed directly at the disposal of people who had nothing to offer him in return, no advancement, no respectability, not even the comfort of a roof to preach under. He went anyway. And once he had gone, he could not see how any man calling himself a minister of Christ could justify not going. This is why what followed in Bristol was not simply revival, but revival that built something to last. Wesley had watched Whitefield stir a field to tears and then leave for America, and Wesley, ever the organizer, ever his mother's son in his instinct for structure, understood something Whitefield's genius for oratory never quite required him to learn. A warmed heart needs a place to keep warm. Within weeks of that first sermon at Henham Mount, he had begun gathering the converts of Bristol and Kingswood into small societies, meeting together, praying together, watching over one another's souls in the same disciplined, accountable way the Holy Club had once watched over its own members at Oxford. By May of that same year, the Bristol societies had raised the money and laid the first stone of a meeting house on the Horse Fair in the Broadmead district, a plain building with a room for preaching and rooms above it where Mr. Wesley himself would sometimes lodge. They called it simply the New Room. It still stands in Bristol today, the oldest Methodist building in the world, and if you have ever had the privilege of standing inside it, you will know that it does not feel like a monument. It feels like a workshop, a place built by people in a hurry to do something useful with the grace that had found them in a field. It is not too much to say that everything Methodism would become, the societies, the class meetings, the bands, the whole intricate architecture of nurture that would eventually hold together a movement of hundreds of thousands of people across 2 continents, has its root in this single instinct Mr. Wesley showed in Bristol in the spring of 1739, that a soul awakened must be gathered, not left to stand alone in the field where it wept. The open-air sermon lit the fire, the society kept it burning. But Bristol also taught him something about the scope of his own calling, and it is here that we come to one of the most quoted lines in the whole Wesleyan story. Not everyone rejoiced at what was happening in the fields around Bristol. Many clergy were scandalized. A priest of the established church, preaching without a parish, without a bishop's leave, crossing freely into other men's parish boundaries as though the whole of England belonged to him. Among those troubled by it was a former Oxford friend, James Hervey, a gentle and earnest man who wrote to Mr. Wesley urging him to mind the ordinary bounds of parish ministry and not trespass where he had no legal cure of souls. It was a fair question by the rules Mr. Wesley had spent his whole life honoring, and it drew from him, in a letter written that June, one of the great sentences of his life. I look upon all the world as my parish. He went on to explain himself carefully, as he always did, that wherever he found himself, he judged it his bounden duty to declare the glad tidings of salvation to whoever was willing to hear them, and that he could not in conscience confine that duty within the arbitrary lines drawn on a parish map, when souls beyond those lines were perishing without ever having heard the gospel preached at all. Notice what has happened to the man between Georgia and Bristol. In Savannah, his rigid devotion to rubric and form had made him nearly useless to the very people he had crossed an ocean to serve. He could not extend grace to Sophie Hopke, or bend his order enough to reach the people around him, and he had come home in defeat, calling himself worse than an unbeliever. Now that same devotion to duty, transformed by Aldersgate and tempered by what he had seen at Kingswood, had become something almost unrecognizable from the young rector of Savannah. A duty so large it could no longer be satisfied by any single church door, a duty that measured itself not by canon law, but by the plain fact of a soul within reach of his voice. The rules had not disappeared from his conscience, they had simply been placed, at last, beneath the greater rule Christ himself had given him, to preach the gospel to every creature. He would spend the rest of his long life proving he meant it. The horse he mounted in Bristol that spring would carry him, and the horses that followed it, some 250,000 miles before he was through rain and frost and mud, into market squares and mining villages and city commons, wherever 200 or 300 people, or 2,000 or 3,000, would gather to hear a man past his 40th year explain that God's grace was for them too, freely offered, already at work in them before he ever arrived to say so. Bristol was where the parish walls came down. Kingswood was where he learnt that the poorest, roughest, most overlooked people in England were not waiting to be persuaded that they mattered to God. They already suspected it, in some wordless way grace had planted in them long before. They were only waiting for someone to come stand in the field and tell them it was true. Bristol, February 1742. The new room stood barely 3 years old, and already it stood in debt. Mr. Wesley had built it plain and built it big, a preaching house for the thousands who had come pouring out of the coal pits and glass houses to hear him and Whitefield preach in the open fields, a room where a growing society could gather under roof when the weather turned. But plain and big cost money, and the little society that used it did not have enough. The builders wanted paying, the society wanted a plan. It was a shipwright and sea captain named Foy who gave them one, a practical man with a practical head, the kind of layman every good work needs and too seldom gets. Divide the society, he said, into small companies of about a dozen each. Appoint one person in every company to call on the other 11 once a week and collect a penny apiece. 12 pennies brought the debt down a little at a time, the way the tide comes in a little at a time, until one day the harbour is full. It was a fundraising scheme. Nothing more was intended by it, not by Captain Foy, and not, at first, by Mr. Wesley. But grace has a way of walking in through doors, opened for other reasons entirely. And this was one of the great providences of the whole revival, that the Methodist people, gathering their pennies, found they had also gathered something Mr. Wesley had been searching for since Oxford without quite knowing its shape. He had built holy clubs, he had built discipline into his own soul stroke by stroke, rule by rule, since he was a boy at his mother's knee reading the day's chapter aloud before breakfast. What he had never quite built, in all his striving years, was a structure simple enough and small enough to hold ordinary men and women, colliers, weavers, servant girls, the poor of Bristol and Kingswood, who could not read Latin and had never heard of Thomas à Kempis, inside the same watchful, weekly, loving accountability that had once kept a young fellow of Lincoln College from wasting a single hour. The class leaders went out to collect their pennies and came back with something else. They came back and told Mr. Wesley, "Some of these people are struggling. some are afraid. Some have fallen back into old sins and are ashamed to say so before the whole society, but will say it, quietly, to one person who asks and listens. Mr. Wesley heard this and did what he always did with a fact on the ground. He built on it immediately. Within weeks, the class meeting was no longer a collection scheme with a spiritual side effect. It was the backbone of the entire Methodist system, and it would remain so for as long as there were Methodists worth the name. Picture it, because it is worth picturing plainly. 12 people, sometimes fewer, rarely many more, in a parlor, a kitchen, a rented room above a shop, once a week, with a leader who was very often not ordained, very often not even literate in the way a gentleman was literate, but who had been walking with Christ long enough and honestly enough to be trusted with the souls of 11 neighbors. The leader asked how it went with their souls that week, not how the harvest went, not how the master had treated them, not the news from London, how it went with their souls. Were they tempted? Did they fall? Did they find that the promises of Scripture held? People said things in that circle of 12 that they would never have said standing before a congregation of 1,000 under the open Bristol sky. The great field preaching gathered the crowd and broke the hard ground. The class meeting was where the seed was tended once it had taken root. Mr. Wesley never claimed the field preaching alone made Methodists. He said, more than once and in more than one place, that without the class meeting the revival would have burned through Bristol and Kingswood and London like a grass fire, bright, astonishing, and gone within a season. It was the 12 in the parlor who kept the coal alight. Beneath the classes he built something smaller and stricter still, the bands, where a class might mix the strong with the struggling, the new convert with the old hand. A band gathered only those who had already given clear evidence of a changed life and who were ready to go further, into a closer and more searching confession. Bands were sorted by age, by sex, by marital state, so that the questions asked could be exact and the shame of asking them could be borne. The rules Mr. Wesley drew up for the bands in 1738, even before Bristol, even before the new room existed, are almost startling to read now for their bluntness. Members were to answer, as often as they met, whether they had committed any known sin since the last meeting, whether they had been tempted, how the temptation was resisted, whether they had thought, spoken, or acted anything they were not willing another band member should know. There was no hiding in a band. That was the whole design of it. Mr. Wesley did not believe holiness could be grown in private any more than a coal could stay lit alone on a hearth. Draw it out of the fire and it goes cold. Keep it among other coals and the whole grate stays warm. Out of this same instinct came the general rules of the United Societies, written down in 1743 so plainly that a child could carry them in memory. Do no harm, do good, attend upon all the ordinances of God. 3 rules, not 39 articles, not a catechism to be memorized before admission. 3 plain rules that any collier or servant could hold in the head while working a 14-hour day. Mr. Wesley was never interested in making membership hard to enter. He wanted it impossible to enter carelessly and easy to enter honestly, and he trusted the classes and bands to do the deeper work that a doorway rule never could. A person joined a Methodist society on the strength of one desire, the desire to flee the wrath to come and to be saved from their sins. Everything after that, the whole slow architecture of growth in grace, happened in the room with the 12. None of this, the classes, the bands, the societies multiplying across Bristol and London and the northern counties faster than any single ordained clergyman could reach, could have held together on Mr. Wesley's preaching alone, however tirelessly he rode. And here the Lord gave him a gift he had not asked for, and, if we are honest, had not entirely wanted at first, the gift of lay preachers. Thomas Maxfield was a young man converted under Mr. Wesley's own preaching, a member of the London Society, left in charge of the foundry meetings while Mr. Wesley was away on one of his endless journeys. Left to lead prayer and exhort the people, young Maxfield did what an exhorting man full of the Spirit will eventually do. He began, in substance, to preach. Word of it reached Mr. Wesley on the road, and he turned back toward London with every intention of putting a stop to it. A layman preaching, without ordination, without a bishop's hand ever laid on him, it cut against everything Mr. Wesley had been raised to reverence about the order of the Church of England, the church that had ordained him, the church he never once in his long life intended to leave. It was his own mother who stopped him. Susanna Wesley, by then an old woman living out her last years at the foundry under her son's care, heard what he meant to do and told him plainly, "Take care what you do with that young man, for he is as surely called of God to preach as you are yourself. Examine what his preaching has done," she said, "before you silence it." Mr. Wesley went and heard Maxfield preach, and the son who had learned from his mother, in the nursery at Epworth, to test every leading by its fruit, did exactly that. He listened for the fruit. He heard sound doctrine and burning conviction, and souls, real souls he could name, brought from carelessness to earnest faith. He put away his objection and never fully picked it back up. From that day the Methodist revival had a second engine alongside Mr. Wesley's own itinerant preaching. Lay men, unordained, examined by Mr. Wesley personally for gifts, grace and fruit, sent out to ride circuits that no bishop's schedule of ordained clergy could ever have covered. There is no way to overstate what this decision cost Mr. Wesley in reputation and what it purchased for the revival in reach. The Church of England had, by law and custom, one clergyman for every parish, and parishes were drawn for a settled agricultural England of centuries past, not for the coal towns and factory villages spilling up across the north where Mr. Wesley's converts now numbered in the tens of thousands. A single ordained priest could serve a single parish faithfully for a lifetime, and never once trouble the darkness 3 valleys over. Mr. Wesley's lay preachers rode where the ordained could not or would not go. Into Cornwall's tin country, up through the Yorkshire dales, into the raw new manufacturing towns that had no old parish church to begin with because they had not existed a generation before. They preached in barns, at market crosses, on hillsides, wherever a crowd would gather and a room could not be found. They were paid almost nothing and expected to itinerate, moving from circuit to circuit every year or two, so that no preacher grew too attached to one people and no society grew too attached to one preacher. It was again Mr. Wesley's practical genius at work. The same instinct that turned a debt-collecting scheme into the class meeting turned an inconvenient young man's exhorting into the whole system of itinerancy that carried Methodism the length and breadth of England within his own lifetime. All of it needed a hub, and London gave it one. In 1739 Mr. Wesley purchased, for a fraction of what it had cost to build, an abandoned Royal Cannon foundry in Moorfields, a burnt-out ruin, in fact, ever since an explosion some years before had killed several workmen and left the government glad to be rid of the site. Out of that ruin Mr. Wesley made the foundry, and the foundry became, for the better part of 40 years, the beating heart of the whole Methodist connection. It held a chapel that could seat 1,500 people, with services at 5 in the morning for those who had to be at work by 6. It held a schoolroom for the children of poor Methodists who could afford no other education. It held a free dispensary, one of the first of its kind in London, where the sick poor could be seen and treated at Mr. Wesley's expense. He had, after all, studied medicine enough at Oxford and after to compile his own book of home remedies for exactly this purpose, and he never saw a contradiction between saving a soul and dosing a fever. It held a book room because Mr. Wesley believed as firmly in the printed page as in the spoken word, and from the foundry press poured forth hymn books, tracts, abridged classics, and the endless stream of his own writings meant to put sound doctrine into hands that might never own another book. His mother lived out her final days there, in rooms provided for her within the old foundry walls, and when Susanna Wesley died in the summer of 1742, it was in the foundry that her body lay before burial, and it was Mr. Wesley himself, by his own account, who could not get through the funeral service without his voice breaking on the words of the resurrection. Bristol had its new room, London had its foundry, and between the two, and beyond them both, ran the connection, the word Mr. Wesley and his people used for the whole living network of societies, classes, bands, circuits and preachers, ordained and lay alike, bound together not by geography, but by shared discipline and a shared hope. It could easily have flown apart. A movement with no bishop over it, no single meeting place, preachers scattered from Cornwall to the Scottish border, societies multiplying weekly among people who had never so much as met one another. Such a thing, left to itself, becomes 100 separate sects within a decade. It did not, because Mr. Wesley gave it one more structure to match the class meeting and the itinerant circuit, the conference. The first conference met in London in June of 1744. 6 clergymen and 4 lay preachers gathered around Mr. Wesley's table to answer, in his own words, 3 questions and no more. What to teach, how to teach it, and what to do, how, in short, to regulate their doctrine, discipline, and practice. It was a small beginning for what would become, within his lifetime, an annual gathering of preachers from every corner of the connection, hammering out together the doctrine that would hold, the discipline that would bind, the appointments that would send this preacher to that circuit for the year ahead. Mr. Wesley chaired every conference of his life, and kept, until the very end, the final word on doctrine and appointment. But he never governed alone, and he never intended to. The conference was Susanna's nursery rules, grown to the scale of a nation, clear boundaries, honestly kept, that let liberty and love flourish safely inside them. It is easy, reading the journal at this distance, to admire Mr. Wesley for his preaching and forget that he was, quite as much, an organizer of near miraculous skill, a man who could turn a debt into a discipleship structure, an untrained exhorter into an army of itinerant evangelists, a burnt-out cannon foundry into the administrative and pastoral heart of a movement that would outlive him by centuries. He never thought of himself as founding an institution. He thought of himself, to his last year, as a priest of the Church of England, doing what plain necessity required to keep newborn souls from perishing for want of care. But necessity, in his hands, became architecture, 12 people in a parlor, a leader who asked the hard question, a preacher on horseback who had never worn a bishop's hand upon his head, and a whole connection of the redeemed learning, week by week, how it went with their souls. On a winter evening in London, sometime in the early weeks of 1740, John Wesley knelt with his brother Charles and a small company of friends and put a question to God that he did not trust himself to answer alone. George Whitefield, his friend, his fellow Oxford Methodist, the man whose preaching had first drawn the great crowds of colliers at Kingswood, held to the doctrine of unconditional election, that God had, before the foundation of the world, chosen some souls for salvation and passed over the rest, and that nothing any person did or failed to do could alter that eternal decree. Mr. Wesley could not believe it. He had read his Greek Testament too carefully, prayed with too many broken and hungry people, watched grace do its quiet work in too many unlikely hearts to accept that some of them had been barred from mercy before Adam drew breath. But Whitefield was his brother in the work, and revival is a fragile, wind-blown thing. To preach against him publicly might tear the fledgling movement in two. So the little company did what the early Methodists so often did when the stakes were high and the will of God unclear. They wrote out possible courses of action on slips of paper, prayed over them, and drew lots. The paper that came up read, "Preach and print." He did both. The sermon was called Free Grace, and it was the plainest, most unyielding thing he ever preached. Grace, he said, is free for all, as well as free in all. It is free for you. Not for the elect only, not for some invisible company chosen from eternity, while the rest of the human race is left to founder, but for you. Whoever you are, wherever you are, however far you have wandered. Whitefield read it and grieved. Their friendship never entirely recovered its old warmth, though their affection for one another outlasted the argument, and even, in the end, buried it. Wesley would one day preach Whitefield's own funeral sermon, weeping as he did it. But the breach mattered, because it forced Wesley to say out loud, and in print, and to the whole of England, the conviction that had been forming in him since Epworth and Oxford and the ship's deck bound for Georgia, that God's grace does not wait to be invited. It goes ahead of us. It is there before we ever think to look for it. This is what the tradition calls prevenient grace, and if you have never sat with the phrase before, let me put it to you plainly, the way Mr. Wesley would have wanted it put. Every soul that has ever drawn breath, the collier at Kingswood who cannot read, the debtor rotting in Newgate, the child not yet old enough to know what sin is, the hardened blasphemer who curses the very name of Christ, every one of them carries within them some trace of God's Spirit, some faint stirring of conscience, some capacity to hear and to turn, and none of it is their own doing. It was placed there beforehand. Prevenient grace is the grace that goes before repentance, before faith, before the sinner has done a single thing to deserve or earn, or even desire it. Susanna Wesley had taught her son as a boy that no soul is born entirely dead to God, that the faint light of conscience is itself a gift and not an achievement. Mr. Wesley spent the whole of his ministry proving that his mother had been right. He never believed that human beings could save themselves. He believed, with his whole heart, that human beings could not help but be reached by a God who never stopped reaching for them first. You can hear why this mattered so much to a man who preached in fields to congregations no respectable clergyman would touch. If grace goes before every soul, then there is no one at all, standing safely outside its reach. Not the Kingswood collier black with coal dust, not the condemned man waiting for the cart to the gallows, not the drunk woman heckling from the edge of the crowd at Moorfields. Mr. Wesley's optimism about human transformation, the thing that let him ride 8 hours to preach to 500 people who had never once heard the offer of mercy made to them personally, was not naivety, it was doctrine. It was the settled theological conviction that every hearer before him, however hardened, already carried some spark that grace itself had lit, and that his preaching was not planting something from nothing but fanning into flame what God had already begun. He did not offer salvation to the deserving, he offered it to the reached for, which in his theology was everyone. But prevenient grace was never meant to be the whole of the gospel, only its threshold. It got a person to the door. What lay beyond the door, what happened after the sinner turned, after the heart was justified by faith, after the assurance of pardon settled in like Aldersgate had settled in him, was a further work, and it was this further work that Mr. Wesley came, over the decades, to regard as the very reason God had raised up the people called Methodists in the first place. He preached the sermon that laid it out as early as 1741, and he called it simply Christian Perfection. He knew the title would cause trouble, and it did, immediately and for the rest of his life. English ears heard the word perfection and understood it to mean flawlessness, an end to every mistake, every lapse of judgment, every moment of forgetfulness, or bad temper, or honest human error. Preachers who wanted to discredit him seized on the word gladly, calling him proud, calling him a man who thought himself above ordinary human frailty, calling the whole doctrine a piece of enthusiastic arrogance. Mr. Wesley answered every one of these charges the same way, patiently, for 40 years, because the answer never changed and he never tired of giving it. Christian perfection, he said, is not perfection of performance. It is not freedom from mistake, or ignorance, or the 10,000 small failures that come from having a body and a memory and a fallen world to live in. A man wholly filled with love could still misjudge a friend's motives, could still take the wrong road, could still speak an unwise word from an honest heart. None of that was sin in Mr. Wesley's careful definition, because sin, properly understood, is a willful transgression of a known law of God, and a mistake made in ignorance, however regrettable, is not that. What Christian perfection meant, he insisted, was perfection in love. It meant a heart from which the last remnants of pride, malice, revenge, and the love of the world had been cleansed by the Spirit of God, so that what remained, filling every corner where those things had lodged, was love of God with all the heart and love of neighbor as oneself. The very commandment our Lord named as the greatest. The commandment Mr. Wesley believed was not a beautiful impossibility dangled before us to shame our failure, but an actual promise, meant to be actually kept. He went back again and again to 2 texts that anchored the whole doctrine. One was Deuteronomy, the Lord's promise to circumcise the heart of his people so that they would love him with all their heart and soul. The other was John's first epistle, Its plain declaration that perfect love casts out fear. If Scripture said such love was possible, Mr. Wesley reasoned, and here you see his mind working exactly the way it always worked, testing every doctrine against the plain sense of the text, against the wisdom of the ancient Christian writers he so revered, against sound reason, and against the actual transformed lives he watched multiplying before him in the societies. Then it was not enthusiasm to preach it, it would have been unbelief not to. He called this being made perfect in love, or entire sanctification, and he distinguished it carefully from justification, the pardon a sinner receives the moment true faith lays hold of Christ. Justification deals with the guilt of sin. It happens as it had happened to him at Aldersgate, in an instant, when the heart trusts wholly in what Christ has done. Sanctification is the further work, sometimes gradual, and sometimes, he came to believe, from the testimonies he gathered by the hundreds, given in a further moment of its own, when the believer, already forgiven, already walking in the assurance of God's favor, is brought by the Spirit to the place where love has driven out every rival affection and reigns alone. He did not claim it happened the same way twice. He collected these accounts for decades, in his own careful hand, in journals and letters and the pages of the Arminian magazine he edited, listening to laborers and servants and shopkeepers describe the hour or the day when they had felt sin's inward power broken and love flood in to take its place. He weighed every account. He was suspicious of claims made too easily, and he said so bluntly to more than one over-eager class leader who announced perfection the way other people announced good weather. But he never once retreated from believing the thing itself was real, because he had seen too much fruit from it to call it fancy. And here is a thing I want you to sit with, because it says as much about the man's honesty as anything in his whole long life. Mr. Wesley never claimed the experience for himself. Ask him directly. And people did ask him directly, sometimes with more cruelty than curiosity, whether he, John Wesley, had attained the perfect love he preached, and he would tell you plainly that he had not yet, not in the way he understood the promise to mean. He was, by his own repeated admission, still a man in via, still pressing forward, still asking God for the gift he urged on everyone else. This never struck him as a contradiction. A man can point faithfully toward a country he has not yet fully entered. He believed the promise was real precisely because Scripture made it, not because his own experience had proven it, and he trusted his own sanctification to the same grace he preached to colliers who could not read their letters. It was this insistence, that entire sanctification was a present possibility, obtainable by faith in this life, not a reward reserved for the hour of death, that made the doctrine the most controversial thing he ever taught, more controversial even than field preaching, more controversial than his break with Whitefield over predestination. Calvinist critics thought it smuggled works righteousness back in through the side door. Cautious churchmen thought it courted spiritual pride, inviting weak souls to boast of an attainment they had not truly reached. Mr. Wesley answered both charges the same way he had answered the charge against his preaching in fields, by pointing to changed lives. He found his fiercest and most faithful champion in John Fletcher, the gentle, learned vicar of Madley, whose checks to antinomianism defended the doctrine with a rigor and charity that Mr. Wesley himself said he could not have matched. Fletcher became, in Mr. Wesley's eyes, the model of what the doctrine actually looked like lived out, not a man boasting of flawlessness, but a man so filled with patient love that people traveled miles simply to sit near him. By the time Mr. Wesley was an old man, this doctrine had become, in his own words, the very reason for the movement's existence. In a letter written in 1786 to a young preacher named Robert Carr Brackenbury, he set it down as plainly as he ever set anything down. This doctrine, he said, is the grand depositum which God has lodged with the people called Methodists, and for the sake of propagating this chiefly he appeared to have raised them up, not field preaching, not the societies dear as they were to him, not even the doctrine of assurance that had changed his own life on Aldersgate Street. The deposit, the treasure entrusted to Methodism to guard and to spread, was this: that grace goes before every soul to make response possible, and that grace, received and trusted, can go on to fill that soul entirely with love, until fear and pride and selfishness have no room left to stand. You will find the question written into the earliest discipline the American Methodists carried west with them into the wilderness, asked of every preacher at every conference, and it gives this chapter its name. Are you going on to perfection? Not have you arrived, not are you flawless. Going on, a present, continuing motion, the same motion that had carried a frightened boy out of a burning rectory, the same motion that had carried a doubting missionary home from Georgia, the same motion that had carried a warmed heart out of a society meeting on Aldersgate Street into 50 years of preaching. Mr. Wesley never asked his people to claim they had finished the road. He asked only whether they were still walking it, still trusting the grace that had met them before they ever went looking for it, still believing that the love it promised was not a distant country reserved for heaven, but a gift held out, even now, to hands willing enough to receive it. Charles Wesley kept a pencil in his waistcoat pocket, the way another man might carry a knife or a coin, always at hand, always ready. He wrote his hymns on horseback, in coach seats, at dinner tables mid-conversation, on scraps of paper that his family learned never to throw away. Some mornings he woke with a whole verse already formed in his head, as though it had been dictating itself to him in his sleep, and he would call for paper before he called for his boots. By the time he died he had written something on the order of 6,500 hymns, hymns for every festival of the Christian year, hymns for the sick, hymns for the dying, hymns for children, hymns of such theological precision that a person could learn the whole of Methodist doctrine from singing them and never open a book of divinity at all. It was Charles, not John, who gave the revival its voice. John gave it order, the societies, the classes, the bands, the itinerancy that stretched from Cornwall to the Scottish Highlands. But Charles gave it song, and a movement that sings together is a movement that cannot easily be pulled apart. When the two brothers stood in Charles's rooms on Little Britain the night of May 21st, 1738, 3 days before Aldersgate, and sang the hymn Charles had written to mark his own conversion, they were doing, without knowing it, what Methodists would go on doing in 10,000 chapels for the next 3 centuries, singing their way into an assurance that argument alone could never quite deliver. A year later, on the anniversary of that strange warming, Charles gave the movement the hymn that has never left it since. Oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing my great Redeemer's praise. 18 stanzas of pure, exultant testimony, more of them than any hymnal has ever had the courage to print in full, though every Methodist who has ever opened a hymn book has sung the first. The brothers were bound by blood, by Oxford, by the Holy Club, by Georgia, by Aldersgate itself, bound so tightly that for years it was impossible to say where one brother's ministry ended and the other's began. And yet they were never quite the same man, and the differences between them widened as the years went on rather than narrowed. John was the organizer, restless, methodical, forever pressing forward into new territory, forever willing to bend a rule of church order if souls were at stake. Charles was more cautious, more troubled by what the two of them were building outside the Church of England's own structures, more grieved every time John ordained a preacher or licensed a chapel without a bishop's hand anywhere near it. Charles never left the Church of England in his heart, not for one day of his life, and he watched with something close to anguish as his brothers' societies grew into an apparatus that looked, however John insisted otherwise, more and more like a church of its own. The brothers argued about it in letters for decades, sharp letters sometimes, letters that only two men who loved each other as much as these two did could ever have written to one another. But they never broke. Whatever else divided them, Aldersgate did not, and the hymns did not, and blood did not. When Charles died in 1788, 3 years before John, it was John who preached at the funeral of the brother whose words he had sung his way into heaven with 1,000 times over, and something in John Wesley, not much showed on the surface of that iron constitution, but something went quiet after that, as though half the song had gone out of the world. Charles, for his part, had married well and married happily. Sarah Gwynne, Sally, as everyone called her, became his wife in 1749, and theirs was by every account a tender and settled marriage, the kind that steadies a household and steadies a man. John's own venture into marriage, 2 years later, brought him nothing of the kind. He married Mary Vazee, Molly, a widow of some property, mother of 4 grown children, in February of 1751, and very nearly did not live to enjoy even the wedding itself. He had fallen on the ice crossing London Bridge shortly before, and preached his next sermon. So the story in Methodist memory has always gone, sitting down, his ankle too swollen to bear his weight standing. It was not, on the face of it, an unreasonable match. Molly had means. John, characteristically, gave most of what she brought him straight to the poor and to the printing of tracts, keeping for himself, as he always had, only what plain necessity required. But a man who is on horseback 10 months of the year, who rises at 4 in the morning wherever he happens to be, who has given his whole life over to a work that answers to no timetable but its own urgency, that man makes, whatever his virtues, a difficult husband. Molly wanted a home and a settled companion. She got a man who was gone before dawn and gone again in a fortnight, whose letters to female correspondents in the societies she came to read with a jealousy that curdled, over the years, into open suspicion and worse. There were separations, several of them, reconciliations that did not hold, quarrels conducted in letters that John, ever the meticulous record-keeper, sometimes preserved and sometimes mercifully did not. In 1758 he wrote in his journal, with the plain, unadorned honesty that marks every page of that record whether the news is triumphant or bitter, that he had not left his wife, had not sent her away, and would not call her back. Words that tell you everything about how far the marriage had already come apart, and how little either party seemed able to mend it. Molly left him for good in 1771, taking some of his papers with her, and though there were letters afterward, there was no reunion. When she died in 1781, John did not learn of it until after the funeral. He wrote of it in his journal with a spareness that says more than any lament could have, a single line, and then the entry moves on, because the itinerancy did not pause for grief any more than it paused for anything else. It would be easy, reading that record, to feel only sorrow for what the marriage cost him, and there is sorrow enough in it to feel. But it is worth setting beside Charles's tenderness with Sally a plainer truth about the man this whole book has been introducing to you. John Wesley had given himself, whole and entire, to a work that left very little room in the middle of his life for anyone to stand beside him as a true companion of the hearth. He had tried in Georgia to love Sophie Hopke and failed to give her what she needed, and the failure had nearly ended his ministry before it began. He tried again at 50 and failed again, in a different way, for different reasons, but the pattern across both failures is the same pattern that runs through everything else in his life. A man who could pour out compassion on 10,000 strangers in a field, and could not, somehow, manage the ordinary tenderness that a single household requires. Grace was teaching him many things across those decades. It seems, on the evidence of the marriage, not to have taught him that. And yet the same restlessness that made him a poor husband made him, in these very years, one of the fiercest and most unrelenting voices raised anywhere in England against the greatest cruelty of his age. In 1774, Mr. Wesley published a short pamphlet titled Thoughts Upon Slavery, and there is nothing halfway or diplomatic in a single page of it. He had read the accounts of the Middle Passage, the plantations, the branding irons, the flesh laid open by the whip, and he set the facts down without softening them, because he believed, as he believed about nearly everything, that the truth plainly stated was itself a form of preaching. He addressed the traders directly. He addressed the planters directly. He would not allow a single reader to hide behind the comfortable fiction that slavery was merely an unfortunate economic necessity, a matter to be regretted from a safe distance, while the profits kept coming in. Liberty, he wrote, is the right of every human creature as soon as he breathes the vital air, and no human law can deprive him of that right, which he derives from the law of nature. It was not the argument of an economist weighing costs and benefits. It was the argument of a man who had spent his whole life insisting that prevenient grace goes out before every soul without exception, the Kalmuk and the Kafir no less than the Londoner, the field slave no less than the peer of the realm, and who could not, having said that 1,000 times from 1,000 different fields, now look at the slave trade and pretend the doctrine had an asterisk attached to it. He preached against it wherever he went in his last years, and he pressed the young men coming up in the movement to carry the conviction forward after him, because he knew, better than most, how long these battles take, and how unlikely he was to see the end of this one in his own lifetime. And so it was that 6 days before he died, February 24th, 1791, an old man of 87 with almost nothing left of his strength but his conviction, he took up his pen one final time and wrote to a young member of Parliament named William Wilberforce, who was carrying the fight for abolition into the House of Commons against opposition that would have exhausted a lesser man's resolve. It was, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine, the last letter John Wesley ever wrote. "Unless the divine power has raised you up," he told Wilberforce, "to be as Athanasius contra mundum, I see not how you can go through your glorious enterprise in opposing that execrable villainy, which is the scandal of religion, of England, and of human nature. Be not weary in well-doing," he urged him. "Go on, in the name of God and in the power of his might, till even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it." Wilberforce kept the letter for the rest of his life. The trade in human beings that Mr. Wesley called execrable in his last written words was abolished in the British Empire 16 years later, in 1807, and slavery itself throughout that empire in 1833. 2 years before Wilberforce's own death, and more than 40 years after the old preacher who had charged him to go on had been laid in the ground behind City Road. He was still riding all through these years, still riding at 70, at 75, at 80, at a season of life when most men of his century had long since surrendered the saddle for the fireside. The itinerancy that had begun in the fields around Bristol in 1739 never slowed. Not really, not until the very last months of his life. He kept the same discipline he had kept at Oxford half a century before. Up at 4, in bed by 10, every hour accounted for, every mile of every journey recorded in the same neat hand that fills the pages of his journal from 1735 almost to 1791. By the time he died, he had traveled something on the order of 250,000 miles on English roads that were, for most of that half-century, barely roads at all, rutted, flooded, icebound in winter, choked with dust in summer, and he had preached something on the order of 40,000 sermons, often 2 or 3 or 4 in a single day, to congregations that ranged from 12 souls in a Cornish farmhouse to 20,000 standing shoulder to shoulder on a Yorkshire hillside. His eyesight dimmed, his handwriting, always neat, grew shakier on the page. He noted his own failing strength in the journal, with the same plain honesty he had always brought to every other subject, neither dramatizing it nor denying it. On his 85th birthday, he thanked God that his eyes were not yet waxed dim, and marveled, with evident and unfeigned gratitude, that he could still write and read and preach without spectacles by candlelight, that his strength for preaching had not abated at all, though he could no longer run or walk as he once had. He preached his last outdoor sermon under a tree at Winchelsea in October of 1790, 4 months before he died, and he was still riding out to societies and preaching houses within a few weeks of the illness that finally took him. Nothing about the discipline changed to the last. He rose at 4 because he had always risen at 4, because the horse was saddled and the road was waiting, and there were still, he was quite certain, souls in Cornwall and Yorkshire and the Scottish lowlands who had not yet heard that God so loved the world. Charles was gone. Molly was gone. Most of the Oxford Methodists who had knelt with him in the Holy Club 60 years before were gone. The revival itself had grown so large that no single man could any longer hold its whole shape in his mind, though he tried, riding from society to society, correcting a class leader here, settling a dispute there, writing letters by the 100 to preachers he could no longer visit in person, as often as either he or they would have wished. He had given his brother's hymns to the Connection, and his own sermons, and his own order to hold it together, and he had given the last letter of his pen to a cause he would not live to see won. What he had left at the very end was the saddle, the same instrument of grace it had always been, carrying an old man in a plain black coat down one more English road, toward one more chapel, one more small gathering of the faithful waiting, as they always had, for the man they still called Mr. Wesley to climb down from his horse and open, once more, the book he had never once, in 50 years, grown tired of preaching. He is buried now under a modest stone behind City Road Chapel in London, and the words cut into it are his own choice, not a committee's flourish. God buries his workmen, but carries on his work. I have stood at that grave. I have watched other pilgrims stand there too, a farmer from Kansas, a schoolteacher from Lagos, a retired bishop from Seoul, all of them quiet in the same particular way, the way you go quiet at a threshold rather than a monument, because that is what it is, not an ending, a threshold. Everything I have told you in these 8 chapters, the boy pulled from the burning house, the earnest young Don pacing Oxford's quadrangles with a notebook of sins, the failed missionary limping home from Georgia, calling himself worse than a heathen, the strangely warmed heart in Aldersgate Street, the fields of Kingswood and Moorfields, the Parlor with its 12 trembling names, the itinerant on horseback riding 4,000 miles a year into his 80s, all of it was preparation for a threshold. And now we are standing at it together, you and I would be a poor guide indeed if I brought you this far and then simply said goodbye. So let me tell you what waits on the other side of this doorway, because this book, the one you are holding, was never meant to be the whole house. It is the porch. It is the place where I take your coat and tell you a little about who lives here, so that when I open the inner door, you are not walking in as a stranger. There are 3 rooms in this house, and each one holds him whole, but each one holds him from a different window. The first room is called Brand from the Burning, and it is the room of beginnings, though I want to be careful here, because beginnings makes it sound like throat clearing, like the part you skim to get to the good part. It is not that. It is the part where you learn why the good part works the way it does. You have already met, in these pages, the fire at Epworth Rectory in 1709. The small boy passed hand to hand out an upper window, while the thatch roof came down in flame behind him. Samuel Wesley, on his knees in the yard, crying that he was content. He had lost his children's inheritance, but they were all safe. You know that John Wesley carried that rescue with him his whole life, that he had an engraving made showing a house on fire with the line beneath it, "Is not this a brand plucked out of the burning?" and that he meant it about himself, always, to his last year. In the full volume, you will sit longer in that yard. You will meet Susanna Wesley properly, not as a footnote to her famous son, but as the theologian she was in her own right, the woman who homeschooled 19 children with a rigor that would humble most seminary faculties, who wrote out a rule of life for her own soul at a time when most women were not permitted to imagine they had a theology at all, who taught John before he could read that grace goes before the soul and meets it, that God is not waiting at the far end of our effort, but walking beside us from the very first step, the seed of what the whole Wesleyan family would come to call prevenient grace, though she never used the word. You will walk with young John through Charterhouse and into Oxford, watch him find Kempis and law, and grow so serious about his own soul that seriousness itself nearly became his prison. You will go to Georgia with him and watch the wheels come off, Sophie Hopke, the failed romance, the church discipline he handled so clumsily it nearly ended his ministry before it began, the humiliating retreat back across the Atlantic with that unbearable line in his journal, "I went to America to convert the Indians, but oh, who shall convert me?" And then, because the book knows where it is going and is not afraid to make you wait for it, you will come at last to a small religious society on Aldersgate Street, the 24th of May, 1738, 9:15 in the evening, someone reading aloud from Luther's preface to Romans, and a heart, his heart, strangely warmed. You have felt the outline of that moment already in this book. In Brand from the Burning you will feel its full weight, because you will have walked every hard mile that led to it, and you will understand, as he did, that this was not the invention of a new man, but the completion of one who had been carried toward this door since the flames at Epworth first spared him for something. That is the first room. It answers the question every honest reader eventually asks of any great life. How did he get here? Not the summary answer, the real one, with the false starts left in. The second room is the world, his parish, and if the first room is about a man's formation, this one is about what a formed man does with 50 years. You have already had a taste of it in these pages, the field preaching he resisted before George Whitefield shamed him into it, the moment he stood on a rise outside Bristol and offered salvation to several thousand coal-grimed miners who had never darkened a church door in their lives, and wept afterward because he had spent so many years, he confessed, so tenaciously sticking to church order that he had been not less scrupulous than a Pharisee about the saving of souls. You have met the 12 people in the Fetter Lane parlor and the beginning of the societies. But there is so much more in the full room. You will meet the Foundry, that abandoned cannon works in Moorfields that became Methodism's first real headquarters, and you will feel the strange electric charge of 5,000 people a week moving through classes and bands there. Ordinary tradesmen and servant girls and coal heavers being asked, every single week, the question that has never stopped being the genius of the whole system: how does it stand between God and thy soul? You will ride with him through riots, real riots, stones and mud, and men hired to break up his meetings, a mob in Wednesbury that nearly killed him, and from which he walked out, by his own account, without a hair of his head harmed, convinced to his marrow that God's hour had simply not yet come for him to die. You will cross the Atlantic again, this time to watch the revival take fire in the American colonies, through Francis Asbury and the circuit riders, and you will feel the particular ache of Mr. Wesley in his old age, watching a movement he built to stay inside the Church of England begin, almost against his will, to become something new and separate, the ordination of Thomas Coke, the letter to Dr. Coke, Mr. Asbury, and our brethren in North America, the birth pains of what would become the Methodist Episcopal Church, all of it costing him sleepless nights, because he never stopped believing he had lived and died a son of the Church of England. This is the room of the revival in its full breadth, not just the Aldersgate spark, but the 50 years of wind that turned that spark into a fire that crossed oceans. And the third room is Go On to Perfection, and this is the room I think you may need most, because it is the room where the house stops being about him and starts being about you. Everything in these first 8 chapters, everything in the 2 rooms I have just described, was building toward a doctrine, though I hesitate even to call it that, because doctrine sounds cold, and this was the warmest conviction of his life: Christian perfection, entire sanctification. The conviction, argued and lived and preached from 1,000 pulpits and market crosses, that the grace which justifies you is not the last word God has for your soul, that the same love which forgives can in this life purify, that a heart can be so filled, so entirely oriented toward the love of God and neighbor, that sin no longer reigns there, does not merely lose the occasional battle, but loses the war. You have heard the golden thread of this running through every chapter of this short book: Susanna's rigor, the Holy Club's discipline, the restlessness after Aldersgate that would not let him rest content with pardon alone, the deathbed at City Road, where the man who had preached perfection for 50 years lay dying and testified, in his last conscious hours, that God was with him. In the full volume you will get the doctrine unfolded properly, not as an abstract system, but as something he wrestled out in real controversy, real correspondence, real pastoral crisis, because people misunderstood him constantly, accused him of claiming sinlessness for himself and his followers, and he had to keep clarifying, keep refining, keep saying no, not that, not perfect knowledge, not perfect judgment, not freedom from mistake or infirmity, but a heart wholly given, a love that has cast out fear. You will meet the Wesleyan quadrilateral there too, not because he ever drew it as a diagram, he never did, but because you will watch him do theology in real time, always with scripture open in his hand, always in conversation with the ancient fathers and the Anglican divines, always reasoning rigorously rather than merely feeling his way, and always trusting that a transformed life is itself a kind of evidence, that experience is not opposed to sound doctrine, but is one of the ways God confirms it. And this third room does something the first 2 do not attempt. It turns and asks you directly what you intend to do about all this, because Mr. Wesley never wrote a word of theology for the sake of admiring it. He wrote to change lives, starting with his own. This room will not let you leave as a spectator. I tell you all this not to sell you 3 more books, though I confess I would love nothing more than to see you carry all 3 home. I tell you this because I made you a promise on the very first page, and I want to make good on it now. I told you this would be an introduction, not the whole story, and that if I did my work well, you would finish it wanting the rest. If that is where you find yourself, if something in you, reading about a boy pulled from a burning rectory, or a young man weeping in Georgia over his own hard heart, or the strange warmth in a room on Aldersgate Street, has stirred something you did not expect, then you are exactly where you are meant to be. That stirring has a name in our tradition. We call it prevenient grace, going before you, drawing you onward before you even knew you were being drawn. It is the same grace that met a small boy at a window in 1709 and a grown man at a meeting in 1738, and it does not run out. It has not run out for you either. I think often of something Mr. Wesley said near the very end, when a friend asked him the secret of it all. The 50 years of preaching, the 80,000 miles on horseback, the societies scattered from Cornwall to Georgia to the American frontier. He did not describe a strategy. He described a discovery, that God's grace is sufficient, that it goes before us, meets us, and, if we will let it, completes what it began. That is not a slogan for a movement. That is an invitation to a life. His life bore it out from the fire at Epworth to the deathbed at City Road, and it has borne itself out in every generation of men and women who took up his societies and his hymn books and his rule of life, and found, to their own astonishment, that the same grace met them too. So here is where I leave you, at this doorway, with my coat already handed off and the inner rooms lit and waiting. Brand from the burning will show you the boy and the making of the man, all the way to that 9:15 on Aldersgate Street. The world his parish will show you what that warmed heart did with 50 years and a world too small to contain it. Go on to perfection will show you the doctrine he loved best and will not let you close the book without asking what you intend to do with your own one, brief, borrowed life. Read them in order if you like a story told properly, or dip into whichever room calls to you first. He was never precious about the order in which grace does its work. I only ask this, read them the way you would sit with an old friend telling you the truth about the hardest and best years of his life, not skimming for information, sitting with it, letting it warm you the way it warmed him. He did not write these things for scholars, though scholars have rightly loved them. He wrote them, wrote them, preached them, and lived them for people exactly like you, restless, half persuaded, wanting more of God than they have yet found, and not entirely sure it is allowed to want that much. It is allowed. He would tell you so himself, if he could, with that particular fierce tenderness that got him run out of some parishes and welcomed like family into thousands of others. The house is open, the rooms are lit, go on in. And until we meet again in one of them, the peace of God, which the world did not give and cannot take away, keep and warm your heart, now and always.